This is the first video on muscle tissues. At this point, you should have covered the action potential video series. If you haven't, make sure you go back and look at the action potential video series. Actually, you can probably watch this video and then go to action potentials, and that flow would be just fine as well. Our learning objectives for this lecture is, number one, just looking at a little bit of anatomy. Name the connective tissue layers that cover and then are embedded within the muscle. Number two, describe the relationship between electroactivity and the sliding filament model. You already have an introduction to this in one of the previous videos, but it's another good chance to revisit this principle now that we've covered electroactivity. Number three, let's define the neuromuscular junction and what happens here, as well as the neurotransmitter that we see. And you probably, if you've watched the series on action potential, you already know that that is acetylcholine. And number four, describe excitation contraction coupling in the best way that you can. Really, that's the theme of the next couple of videos that we're going to make. So for the first learning objective, connective tissue layers, here it is. You know, if you've ever had a piece of steak before, you know that the steak itself, or the piece of meat that you're looking at, has some connective tissue on the outside, that tough connective tissue. Sometimes you'll find people saying stuff like, hey, when you get a really tough piece of steak like that, or really chewy, gristly type of meat, then throw it in the slow cooker, and that'll break down all this stuff to a nice, chewy, gelatinous goop. Maybe goop's not the best term, but for those of you who love spending time in the kitchen, sometimes you'll hear about stuff like that, buying tougher cuts of meat and having to slow cook to break some of this connective tissue down. The point is that there's connective tissue that wraps everything up. So we'll start from the smallest level, and the smallest level here is a muscle fiber. Now, when you say muscle fiber, when I say muscle fiber, what we really mean there is a muscle cell. Now, up until now, you've probably come accustomed thinking about cells as being kind of spherical, like a tennis ball or a baseball or something like that. And without a doubt, there are many cells that take on that spherical shape. But muscle cells are a little bit different. And muscle cells are different in the fact that they're long and they're cylindrical. You can almost think of them like a straw that you get at Burger King or at McDonald's or something. So that big long straw here is your individual muscle cell, also known as a muscle fiber. Now, what you'll see is that each of those muscle fibers themselves is actually wrapped up in a little thin piece of connective tissue, and that is called endomysium. And what we'll see here is that a whole bunch of muscle fibers or muscle cell are actually packaged together into a bundle. So that bundle right over here is called a fascicle, and that fascicle has connective tissue wrapping everything up, and that connective tissue is called perimysium, the word right over here. Perimysium covers fascicle. And what is a fascicle? It's a bundle here, bundle of straws. Next, when you look at the muscle itself, and now we've seen a bunch of muscles, let's imagine this as brachioradialis, for example. The muscle itself, if you were to cut it open, you can actually see a bunch of fascicles in there. On this image, we're looking at, what is that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe an eighth one tucked back there. So 7 to 8 fascicles here, each fascicle containing a whole bunch of muscle fibers. So the whole thing itself, like all those fascicles bundled together, are also bundled up in connective tissue, and the name of that connective tissue is epimesium. Now, realistically, there's not much to say in terms of beyond what we just said in naming these things and being able to identify them, but what I will say is that we're going to see this type of organization again later. When we do the nervous system, this next slide, I put it in a nerve. This is actually a nerve. And what we'll see is there's an individual nerve. It says here axon. I'll explain what an axon is at another point. But that axon is covered with a piece of tissue, which is myelin. We'll ignore him as well. But that piece of tissue is called endoneurium. Endoneurium sounds a lot like endomysium, right? And a whole bunch of those neurons are bundled together into a fascicle, and that fascicle is wrapped up in a tissue called perineurium, which should sound a lot like perimysium. And finally, a whole bunch of fascicles are bundled together and wrapped up in epineurium, which sounds a lot like epimesium. Okay, and so these prefixes, endo, peri, epi, you end up seeing these things again later on down the road, and this pattern of organization is the same within muscles or skeletal muscles as it is in nerves, which is this slide over here. Okay, so now let's take a step back again and look. We've talked about this in a previous video, but I do want to kind of get back into it. Two general events for muscle contraction. You know that electrical stuff needs to happen, and then from there proteins move. That action potential PowerPoint and series of videos that I made, that describes all the electrical stuff that you need to know, from resting membrane potential to generation and propagation of an action potential. And then after all that electrical stuff happens, where we left off there in those series was that the electrical event happens and the action potential travels down the T-tubule. And that T-tubule eventually then it hits that bag of calcium. And that bag of calcium was the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And that's where we really pick up on the part 2, which is proteins must move. And when the proteins move, we refer to that as your sliding filament model. And that's where we got to spend a lot of time in probably the next video after this one. So we've seen this slide before. It should be very familiar. The nerve comes down, it spits out acetylcholine, which are these blue dots. This is the motor end plate. You generate an action potential at the motor end plate. It's propagated along the sarcolemma, which is the fancy name for cell membrane. It dives into the T-tubule, which is just a poked-in hole, an invagination, a folding of that plasma membrane. The action potential dives through the T-tubule, and then it hits the sarcoplasmic reticulum, releasing calcium. And from there, calcium goes and does stuff which initiates this activity of the sliding filament model. So there's the big picture. Just to highlight again, this is all the electrical stuff that we've already done, and then we need to pick up here with the protein-related stuff. So let's zoom in, though. Before we get into some of the protein stuff, what I do want to do is just take a closer look right over here. There's not a lot of new information that I'm going to share with you, but there's some new images that I want you to see. So if we zoom in right over here, this neighborhood right over here has a name. And so if I were to kind of box it in, then what neighborhood am I talking about? I'm really talking about this section right over here. Okay, and so I know you can't see it, but what that section would be, and that section right over there is called the neuromuscular junction. So let's break those terms down. What does neuromuscular junction mean? What we mean by that is the junction, where two things get together. A junction is just where things meet together between the neuro portion of your physiology and the muscle point of your physiology. So neuro here, muscular junction, and that's this whole neighborhood right over there. So let's look at what that looks like. So we take this picture, and there's my nerve coming down and talking to my skeletal muscle, and see that box right over here? Let's zoom in on that. If we zoom in on that, here's what we see. So we're going to see, well, actually, now we just have a closer look at it. Action potential is propagated down the nerve. The axon ends the nerve. The nerve ends at the neuromuscular junction. And then if we zoom in on the box, now there's the zoomed in box. So this is that nerve. So where are we at? If you lost track of where we are, it's this section where I put that box before. Right over here is what we zoom in to see this. So a couple things that you'll notice here. You'll notice that these little blue dots again are the neurotransmitters. If we were to zoom in one more time right on this box over there, then we see this image. And so there's my neurotransmitters being released. They come on over and they end up binding to receptors on this side, which allows opening of sodium channels. And so these are these chemically gated sodium channels that we've mentioned before. Let's take one zoom out here. So remember, all this section here is the neuromuscular junction, and this is where action potentials themselves are generated. One thing that you should be aware of is that you should be aware that once acetylcholine binds onto the receptor, it gets broken down just a moment later. There's an enzyme floating around in there called acetylcholinesterase. And what acetylcholinesterase does, it breaks down acetylcholine. So it comes in, it binds, the doors open just for a moment, and then just a moment later, that neurotransmitter gets broken down. So the point being that it's not like you can have a nerve signal to the muscle one time and then have the muscle continue to contract for the next 10 minutes. If you want the muscle to contract for the next 10 minutes, then you need to continue to dump out acetylcholine for those next 10 minutes. So from there, that's where we really get into the action potential PowerPoint. You would slide it in right over here and watch that series of videos if you've not done so already. If you have watched that series of videos, and hopefully a lot of this stuff is a refresher for you. Now, a couple of questions I've asked here. What happens if there is no action potential coming down the nerve? Well, if there's no action potential coming down the nerve, at the end of it, the answer is there's no muscle contraction. But why not? Why is there no muscle contraction? Because if there's no action potential coming down the nerve, there's no action potential generated. If there's no action potential generated, there's no action potential propagated. If there's no action potential propagated, then there's no release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. If there's no release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, then there is no sliding filament model, and therefore your muscle itself doesn't contract. The next question then is, what happens at the neuromuscular junction? Well, we just described that. That's the release of acetylcholine. And number 3, what is the role of the sarcolemma? The role of the sarcolemma is simply to carry along all of this sarcolemma. That's where the action potential travels. Okay, so now moving on. This should look familiar to you. I'm not going to rehash that. This is just another picture of an action potential. And again, the electrical stuff and the protein stuff. One more time, the electrical stuff all up here and the protein stuff. So here's where we're at. We named the connective tissues that cover and embed within the muscle. We named described the relationship just briefly between electrical activity and the sliding filament model. We described what happens at the neuromuscular junction as well as the neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, that lives there. And excitation, contraction, coupling is all of this stuff that happens together. And to be honest, you can't quite fully describe this yet. I just want to leave that in there as a learning objective because you need this in your head as you go through this video as well as the follow-up videos. So we'll close that out now, but in the next video what I want to do is I want to start zooming in on this section. Now that calcium is released, so what? What happens? In other words, let's get into the sliding filament model itself. So this section over here, I highlighted in green, this is what we need to focus on in at least the next, probably the next 2 to 3 videos. And we'll wrap it up here.